Welcome to episode 130 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, SEVEN health.com/130.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey all, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. It's been a while since I released a new episode, which wasn't intentional. Life has been plotting against me and getting in the way of me putting out new episodes. I'll save all the details for when I do a life update, but I can give you a bit of a mini update about what's been keeping me busy. Over the summer, we had a number of visitors over. First, my brother and his girlfriend and their two kids came over. Then a couple of weeks later, my parents came over. We then went away with my parents. We went to Sitges in Spain. So it's about 40 or 50 minutes from Barcelona along the same coastline. And it's lovely. There's loads of nice food and we have lovely weather. And Ramsey got to spend time at the beach. He's definitely inherited my love of the water and sand and being on the beach. And holidays definitely aren't the same as they used to be prior to having a child, but it was really nice to get away. Over this time as well, Ali, my fiance, had 2 more surgeries, which thankfully should be the end of things on the surgery front. I also had a number of last-minute guest cancellations for the podcasts. And so there were episodes that were meant to go out, but then they got cancelled. And so these had been booked in for later dates, but it just meant that nothing got put out. And then I was also signing up new clients and starting with new clients over this time. And it really does take a lot of time to do initial chats with people and go through all the forms for us to get started. So all this is to say I've had a busy couple of months where my usual work times have been interrupted and clients always take priority. But lately, once I'd finished up with client work and because of the increased parenting that needed to happen, there wasn't much time left over and hence the podcast going MIA. So I'm hoping to get things back on track with the podcast. And in the beginning, it might be a bit less than weekly, but the goal is still to get back there. So that is the plan. And this week it is a solo episode. So it's a little shorter than usual, but hopefully it's still interesting and useful. And what I'm going to be covering is a study that is typically referred to as the Fiji Study. And the actual study name is Eating Behaviour and Attitudes to Television Among Ethnic Fijian Adolescent Girls. And this is a study I'd heard referenced before on podcasts. It's also talked about in different books. I've definitely heard Carolyn Costin talk about it, but there's definitely others who mentioned it. And so what I decided to do was go and read the full study, which was very interesting. And so I decided to do this episode covering what happened as part of the study and what the results were. I've actually done episodes like this before where I go through a study or multiple studies. So if you like this episode, then there's some others I could suggest checking out. Episode 42 on the Minnesota starvation experiment. There's episode 81 and 83 looking at how the environment affects our eating. Although these episodes were based on the work of the Cornell Food and Brand Lab and Brian Wansink, and Wansink's work has now come under question and lots of studies have now been retracted. So I honestly don't know how much of that research to believe anymore. Episode 85 looks at the A study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. So basically how childhood trauma affects physiology and behavior. Episode 114 is on weight set point theory and the research surrounding how the body regulates its own weight. Episode 120 is on the replication crisis, so the failure in science for many studies to be replicated and what this means. And then there's episodes 102 and 127 looking at how dieting thoughts, known as cognitive dietary restraint, affects various systems within the body. So if you are new to the podcast, or even if you've been listening for a while but haven't gone back through all the older episodes, those are some that are in a similar vein to this one, where I go through research and explain it, hopefully in an easy to understand way. So let's get started with the Fiji study. So it's a study that came out in 2002. It appeared in the British Journal of Psychiatry. And the study actually included 2 waves. So the first being in 1995 and the second was then in 1998, so 3 years apart. And what the study wanted to look at was how television has an impact on eating behavior and body image. And the reason why this is such a great study is that for most of the world, television in 1995 had been a constant for decades. And we often talk about the impact of television and how this affects our beliefs or our perceptions. But because television has now been a constant throughout our lives, it's hard to quantify how much of an impact this is happening. But for Fiji, this was different. It wasn't until 1995 that TV made its way to Fiji. And this isn't technically true. Like prior to this, in the early 1990s, TV was temporarily introduced to broadcast the Rugby and the Cricket World Cup. But it wasn't until June 1994 that the first permanent commercial broadcasting network was founded in Fiji. And for Nadroga, which is the area in which the study was completed, it wasn't until 1995 that television was introduced. So when they did the first wave of the study in 1995, television had been introduced a couple of weeks prior to that first wave. Another reason why Fiji is such a great place to do a study like this is because its values of beauty, at least back in 1995, were very different to that of Western culture. So in the West, the thin ideal had been something that had been around for a long time. So even if we remove TV, every other piece of advertising and cultural norm really reiterates this belief. But for Fiji, this was different. And I'm going to quote the study here in their description. So, quote, similar to other Polynesian groups, ethnic Fijian traditional aesthetics ideals reflect a preference for a robust body habitus. Thus, the prevailing pressure to be slim, thought to be associated with dieting and disordered eating in many industrialized societies, were distinctly absent in traditional Fiji. In addition, traditional Fijian values and practices encourage robust appetites and a widespread vigilance for and social response to appetite and weight loss. Individual efforts to reshape the body by dieting or exercise thus traditionally have been discouraged. End quote. So I should add that prior to television, there was print media, there was movies, there was videos and advertising that included Western beauty ideals. But once television came in, it was the most accessible and most widely consumed medium. So it did mark quite a shift, especially as we'll see once we get into the results of the studies. So the participants in the study were all Fijian adolescent girls. They were enrolled into secondary schools in Nadroga during their respective time periods. And in the first wave in 1995, there were 63 respondents who participated in the study. And in the second wave in 1998, so 3 years after television had been introduced, 65 participants participated in the study. And I should add that the participants that were in wave 1 were different to the ones that were in wave 2. So this study wasn't following the same individuals to see how their beliefs changed over time, but it did pick people from the same age group and the same schools to see how opinions and behaviours have changed over this time. So as part of the study, the subjects in both waves completed an eating attitudes test known as the EAT or EAT 26. So there's 26 questions as part of it, and it includes questions concerning binging and purging behaviors. I'll link in the show notes to the EAT 26 online. So if you're interested, you can have a look at the questions yourself. But as an example, some of the questions were, I'm terrified about being overweight. I find myself preoccupied with food. I feel extremely guilty after I've eaten. I eat diet foods. I vomit after I've eaten. So that's just an example of some of the questions. The questionnaire is then scored. And an EAT 26 questionnaire with a score of 20 or above is considered to be high, and this indicates a high level of concern about dieting and body weight or problematic eating behaviors. And as I said, this survey was done in both waves, so in 1995 and in 1998. And in addition, in 1998, extra survey questions were then asked about body image and dieting and possible disparities between the subjects and their parents' views around eating and weight. And they also did 30 longer form interviews with subjects from 1998 group. So in this 1998 section, they had both the quantitative data as part of the E26 and then the qualitative data as part of the interviews. So what did the study find? So in 1995, the percentage of subjects with a high EAT score, EAT26 score, was 12.7%. And by 1998, this had shot up to 29.2%. So a nearly tripling. But it does show that issues around food and body were already present. So sometimes this study is presented as if there was no eating or no dieting issues in Fiji until television turned up. But this is clearly not the case, considering that 12.7% of the 1995 group already was scoring high on the EAT26. But back to the results. In 1995, the percentage of subjects that reported self-induced vomiting to control their weight was 0%, and by 1998, it was 11.3%. Television viewing in Fiji at the time of the study was actually done collectively. So even if you personally didn't own a television, it was normal to go to someone else's house and to watch it and done like as part of the community or people doing it together. But despite this, for respondents who lived in a household that did have a television, they were 3 times more likely to have EAT or EAT26 score greater than 20 than someone whose household didn't own a television. Subjects that felt that they should eat less were more likely to report self-induced vomiting. And interestingly with this one, it was not correlated with someone's actual BMI, but rather how they perceived their weight. So it didn't matter what they weighed, it mattered what they thought of that weight. In 1995, the researchers didn't actually collect any data on dieting because of the strong cultural tradition against dieting. They felt that it was rare. And it's kind of frustrating that this is the case, because considering that there was 12.5% already in the high range, I would imagine that even though traditionally dieting was rare, it was probably still happening, or at least it was happening in the teenage demographic who were used as part of this study. But by 1998, when they did collect data, 69% of the survey population said that they had dieted to try and lose weight. And 74% of the survey population reported they felt too big or fat at least some of the time. And this is a rather stark change in attitudes, considering that the cultural norms had always supported a larger body size. And the interviews that were then done with 30 respondents in 1998 also garnered many insights. So of those interviewed, 83% responded that they felt television had influenced them and or their friends to feel differently about or change their body. And 77% reported television had influenced their own body image. They actually articulated that they wanted to reshape their body or lose weight to look more like Western television characters. And based on the responses, some of the shows that they were watching were things like Beverly Hills 90210 and Xena Warrior Princess. They also made reference to Cindy Crawford and Those European Girls as an aesthetic to admire. They also mentioned about the differences in opinions between them and their parents in terms of what was an appropriate weight and an appropriate amount of food to eat. So, for example, 31% of the study participants felt that their parents felt that they should eat more than what they themselves thought was appropriate. And to quote the study again, narrative data explicitly links changing attitudes about diet, weight loss, and aesthetic ideals in the peer environment to Western media imagery. The impact of television appears profound, given the long-standing cultural traditions that previously appeared protective against dieting, purging, and body dissatisfaction. End quote. Now, I should add that there are likely other changes that occurred between 1995 and 1998 that could account for some of these changes in how the subjects felt about their body or their behaviours. And television feels like it is the obvious reason, but we can't rule out other things. So what other social, cultural, economic, religious, or other factors were changing at the same time that television was introduced? And part of the study, or in the study, they actually make reference to this. So again, to quote, "In the past several decades in Fiji, subsistent agricultural lifeways that prevailed for centuries have yielded to a cash economy, and an increased participation in the global economy has brought a rise in consumerism and increasing opportunities for and pressures to engaging wage earning among youth. Thus, television is potentially only one of several social factors contributing to the increased prevalence of the high EAT 26 scores and induced vomiting in the 1998 sample." End quote. So television is the big thing that makes, maybe the big thing that makes these changes, or maybe it's just more broadly Fiji's adoption for a more Western way of life and consumerism. And my sense is it's probably a combination of both, although television probably played a large supporting role as part of this. So that's the study and its findings. So what is the take-home message that I have for you based on this study? Disordered eating and eating disorders are multifactorial, and genetic factors definitely make some people more susceptible to getting a full-blown eating disorder, while someone with different genetics maybe lingers in a place as on and off restriction and on and off dieting. But one of the big factors that makes this restriction or this dieting or this purging more likely is the media landscape that we currently live in. And we can rather naively feel that this doesn't impact on us. Like, we know that images are photoshopped, that actors or actresses on TV aren't the norm in terms of their body shape and size, that movies and television are contrived using shorthand stereotypes or tropes or motifs that don't necessarily match up to the real world. But even if we know this rationally, when this is all that we see, it's hard for it not to affect our view of the world and how we perceive ourselves. We are such visual creatures. What we see does have an impact on our perception of what is normal or what is beautiful. And the Fiji study demonstrated this perfectly, even against a backdrop of preference for a bigger, more robust body. The Western thin ideal won out in the hearts and minds of those in the study. And while this has an impact on all of us, it is especially true for teenagers. It's a time in our lives when we are struggling to find our identities. We are breaking away from what our parents believed and trying to determine what is true for us. We're incredibly body conscious and insecure, and partly due to the huge changes that have occurred in our bodies and in our desires over a short number of years. At this stage, we're both more vulnerable and more susceptible to having our beliefs shaped about what's normal and what's beautiful and what we should be working towards. But I also think it's a good reminder that what we take for granted as normal is cultural. What we often think of as universally attractive is rarely universal. It also shows, though, how temporary and changeable this can be. With one set of input, we get one set of beliefs. With another set, you get something different. I've talked about it before on podcasts, and I know it's probably pretty common advice these days, but it really does help to diversify the images and the media you're consuming. Instagram, when used correctly, can be an incredible force for good on this front, as there's so many different accounts showing so many different people and bodies and shapes and sizes that you can follow. And never before could you have this kind of diversity at your fingertips. And we could also look up from our phones and see the real people around us. I often suggest to clients to go to public pools or public gyms, and when they're getting changed, to look around, and not in a creepy way, but to actually see other real bodies, because it's so rare to see nudity or scantily clad bodies in real life. It ends up only being the bodies that we see in magazines and television and movies, and these tend to fall into a very narrow and largely unattainable band. And I know this can feel like a drop in the ocean, that we're still swimming in a sea of shows and images that continue to prop up the thin ideal. But for the clients who have actually done this and made it a regular practice, it is amazing how their perception changed. And that's perception about others, but importantly, about themselves. So that is it for this week's show. I'm hoping to be back with another episode next week, but if not, I will catch you the week after. And either way, I look forward to being with you on another episode soon enough.
Thanks for